We love that here. So I'm going to keep it going because we want to try to get back on track with our next speaker, who's Stefan Beyer from Solidified, and his talk is called The Confusing World of Smart Contract Security. So give a round of applause for Stefan, everybody.
Okay, so this talk is going to be relatively similar to the previous one. There's going to be a few differences of opinions, but which we should discuss afterwards. But yeah. So this is called The Confusing World of Smart Contract Security, and I'll talk you a bit through the different options companies have for contracting security services, and also what you can do before even thinking about getting an audit, what you can do as a project internally. So just quickly about me and about the company. I'm from a distributed systems background, and at some point I went into cybersecurity and then decided to combine the two. And I now run a company called Oak Security, which has two brands, one of which is Solidified, which looks at the Ethereum ecosystem. Solidified has been around since 2017 and is one of the oldest audit companies around. And we've audited a great number of projects over the years and have developed a methodology which is somehow unique. But anyway, let's go back to 2016, which is when security first became apparent as a problem in Web3. Everyone, well, most people here will remember the DAO hack or exploit, the younger ones might not. But it was sort of the first time where smart contract security became a problem for the wider community. It affected 15% of all ETH in circulation at the time, which was obviously important. So I'm not here to talk about the DAO or exploit. Anyone who doesn't know about it can read about it. There are plenty of sources, but it's also when security audit services became a thing, right? People started founding companies, us as well, to look at this problem. And then fast forward to last month, June 2023, and there were 3 re-entrancy exploits, the same exploit of the DAO hack, in 3 big projects, according to this list here, which is a good source of anything related to re-entrancy attacks. That shows a number of things, but it shows that in 7 years we've not really moved on in smart contract security, right? We still have the same exploits. We've got other exploits as well, but there's still a problem around. Similarly, if we look at the Rect leaderboard, which is a good source to look at everything that happens in DeFi or in Web3, you can see the top 10 here, a snapshot from 2nd of July. There, of the top 10 hacks or exploits, 8 projects were unaudited, right? And the other 2 were audited. So that's interesting. A lot of projects are unaudited. And another interesting thing is if we were to go down this list to 100 or more, we would see a lot of names of audit companies listed there as well, right? So even the audited projects are not safe. And that's a very important thing, and that's what I sort of, where I disagree a bit from the previous speakers, the skin in the game idea. There's only so much an audit can do, right? There are, and I explain a bit why later in the slide, but the auditor does not have the full responsibility for hack or exploit. There are other things very often that can go wrong. Of course, there are incidents of auditors doing really bad work. So what is an audit, first of all, right? So an audit is a time-boxed review by security experts. You get a number of people applying a number of techniques in a certain methodology or process. Every company has their own way of doing things. And they look at, they return a list of problems in a project. And that's very efficient at detecting certain problems, right? So a number of findings are very good for audits and type of exploits. There are vulnerabilities that a team usually doesn't detect, but an audit does, just because external eyes, a methodology being applied and someone working differently. But on the other hand, there are certain things where an audit is very bad at finding things. There are bugs that are very easily found in fast testing or in any type of testing, and very difficult to find in a code review. And that's where other things have to come into play, right? So an audit is just one slice of this famous Swiss cheese approach to security. An alternative to audits as mentioned by the previous speaker, are audit competitions. And an audit competition is like an open audit where more people can sign up anonymously, not so anonymously, however they want, and they can provide findings, and there's a certain budget with a shared amount, anyone who among the people that have findings. We compare the two in a minute, but just to complete things, there are also bug bounties, which are sort of a last resort. You put up a very high price tag to basically convince people to look at your already live project and report bugs instead of exploiting them, and maybe even convince a black hat to turn white hat and not run an exploit. You know, if you've got a 3 million exploit possibility and you've got a 1 million bug bounty, it might be easier to take the million and not go to prison or not risk going to prison. So that's sort of the idea behind it. So which is best, right? So the previous speaker had a clear opinion on this, and I sort of say it depends, right? I think the previous speaker also agreed that traditional audits have a place. The difference between a competition and the other two, between an audit and the competition and a bug bounty is that it usually goes deeper, right? When we pay our auditors to look at things, we choose a professional team applying certain methodologies, and they look at every line of code at a certain price, of course. But you can be sure everything is covered, and if you've got a serious provider, you get very transparent overview of who's auditing your code, how long he spends on the code, and what they find and what they do, and what methodologies they apply. Right? If you don't get that, if you don't get the background of the people working on your code, or the number of hours or engineering weeks invested in this, that's a red flag. But anyway, in a competition, you get much more eyes, but they don't look as deep, usually. And we know that because we encourage our auditors and our freelance participants to also do competitions and bug bounties. We consider that good training for them, and they like that. But they all agree they don't go very deep, because there's particularly if a project is very bad and there's a budget is meant to be shared amongst a lot of people, it's just easier to move on after a certain amount of time. So they look for the obvious findings, they report them, and then they move to the next project. So they don't go as deep, they don't cover every line of code. It's like an 80-20 approach. And the same goes for a bug bounty, right? People don't spend a month on a bug bounty usually, working full time. They, look if they can see anything. If they can't, they move on to the next one. And obviously, a bug bounty also has a disadvantage that it's very expensive, right? If you have $1 million bug bounty, you have to have $1 million in reserve to make sure you can pay it out, and it should be a last resort. That million you pay out for a critical issue should be less than the exploit, the potential exploit. So now I want to talk a bit about our approach. Obviously, I believe in this approach, but the idea of this slide is not to sell you that this is the only and the best approach. It's just to give you a bit of an insight what goes on and what type of questions you should ask when you talk to us or any other provider, and there are plenty of good ones. So our process has been developed since 2016, 17, depending on if you take the start date of the company or when we first started thinking about these things. And basically, we have a pool of auditors, and we literally choose them with very different backgrounds. And whenever we get an audit, we make sure every line of code is covered by at least 3 people, probably more. And they are chosen differently to apply different methodologies. Of course, we have our global process, but within that, they are free to choose their methodology, and we make sure these methodology are complementary, right? They're not all doing the same things. Because that's important, because now, for example, it's become fashionable to get a solo audit, right? A lot of people on Twitter are selling their service as a solo auditor, and that's fine, but you have to bear in mind, you get one point of view, one methodology, one set of eyes. Different people thinking differently, with a different background, find different things. We also make sure there's the background is different and matches the project, right? So if we have a DeFi project with an economic component, we always make sure there's an economist on the team. We don't just employ computer scientists or security, well, they're all security experts, of course, but They have a background in economic modeling, some of them. And then when they get to work, they work blindly. That's a big difference to other companies. Blinded, or blindly, whatever, in the sense that they don't share their findings with each other. They talk to each other, of course, discussing the project, architecture, design, but they don't share their findings until a certain point in the audit, which we call the consensus meeting. And the reason for this is obviously to keep everyone on their toes, right? Nobody wants to be that person in the consensus meeting that has missed a critical issue. That's usually a bit of an internal competition. But it also stops people from biasing each other. And importantly, it gives us points, it gives us data for quality control. If we have a lot of overlap, then we are relatively good usually. If there's not enough overlap, we have to look into the project, look at what went wrong, maybe offer training to people that have missed something and try to make the team stronger this way. And everything is transparent, right? So our clients get a report, and the report is always made public, and everything is discussed. So they see the auditors, they know who they're dealing with, they know their background. And I'm not saying this is the best way, but of course I believe it's the best way because that's why we've chosen it. But it should give you ideas what type of questions you should ask when you talk to an audit service provider, right? Like, who are these people? Do they cover economic aspects of my protocol? Do they look into, for example, if it's cryptography, if there's a CK rollup processor, for example, do they understand how the CK stuff works? Is there a cryptographer on the team? And how do they work? What are the methodologies involved? Do they write tests, or do they just look at the code? We do both. We have people doing formal methods, and we try to mix and match. Anyway, so this is all good, but I said before, projects have to take responsibilities themselves, because an audit is only one slice in the Swiss cheese thing. What can projects do before an audit, or during an audit, or even during the whole life cycle? So there are a lot of things that can be done in terms of tooling, right? Particularly in the Ethereum world. There are a lot of tools available. Testing is essential. Unit testing, 100% code coverage, or at least high code coverage. That makes sense. 100% code coverage can be very bad code coverage. You don't necessarily find everything just because you've 100% code coverage, test coverage. You can look in things like fast testing. You should always run static code analysis, right? Tools like Slither are very good at finding the obvious stuff. I always say these tools are good at finding the type of exploits we had in 2016, 2017. So a re-entrancy possibility they usually highlight. You don't have to have an issue with external calls and re-entrancy in an audit. That's something that a good team can find by themselves before an audit. Anyway, there are a lot of tooling available. Okay. You should also look at, other things. So smart contracts are only a small part of a project. There are other things involved, like key management. You can pay 100K for an audit and then upload your private key onto GitHub, right? We've seen that, teams just having key leakage or a bridge having their hotkey not secured, that sort of thing. There's a lot of off-chain code involved usually. Your APIs, your user interfaces. A lot of projects get their DNS hijacked instead of their smart contract hacks, and they're just diverted to a different user interface, interacting with different smart contracts, or not even with smart contracts, right? There's humans involved. Users and employees do very weird things, right? You have to try to anticipate these things. You have to have policies for it. You have to have policies for what do you do when things go wrong. What do you do when a key is exposed? How do you revoke that? How do you issue a new one? If you have a plan for all these things, it's much easier to deal with it. And finally, this is the last slide. Usually when we're dealing with Web3, it's financial software, right? And that's critical software. So a lot of teams just don't realize that they're building financial software. Financial software means you need someone with a financial mind on the team, right? So if you're building financial software, get a finance guy on the team, right? Get someone who knows the finance system. Don't just invent a new economic model and think it's just going to work, and there are no ways to game it. Game theory type of economic exploits are a very big thing. Specify and document everything. That should be clear, right? You can only implement the model correctly if it's specified and documented, right? Your developers won't be able to implement the finance guys' ideas if they're not written down carefully or correctly. Slow down, do everything carefully, test everything, keep it simple. The type of code NASA would write to send a spaceship out, that's the type of code you want to write in a smart contract for a DeFi protocol. And just don't innovate everything at once. Just, the new economy can be built in small steps, and you don't have to reinvent everything and just expect it to work. So that's just my advice for projects. You can find us at our website and on Twitter. And of course, you've got me here for questions. Yeah, sure. Yes. Oh.
Hey, hello? Okay. Thanks for your great talk. What I want to ask you is, so obviously the state of security right now in Web3 and noticeably in DeFi is not good, right? I think we can all agree with that. So my question would be like, what is your perspective as an auditor, how we need to innovate, or maybe as well how auditors need to innovate that we as an ecosystem become better? I understand your view, right? It's not all on the auditor. It's not, the auditor is not the only one responsible. But I still think we need to innovate as well in the auditing space, because somehow we have to overcome this challenge, right?
Yeah, and that's right. And I completely agree with you that competitions are a good way to do that. And as you, I think there should be a second step, because you mentioned this problem, and that's what our auditors, when they go to competitions, they complain about, that if a project is really bad, they're paid less, because it should be the other way around, right? So competitions are a good complementary approach, and I don't want to make an announcement here, but we are exploring ways of combining these two things, and maybe we should sit down and talk on how we can work together on this. Cool. And obviously another thing, that you say the state of security is bad, and it is true, but it's becoming better. One of the problems is that everyone grows too quickly and too fast, including auditing companies. I mean, we've been around for a long time, but we've grown very carefully. We deliberately rejected a lot of work because we just didn't want to employ 100 auditors that were not, the best. So we have deliberately stayed small. And some others might not have done this. I mean, you mentioned a company before, and I listened to a talk to them last year in August, where they said they had done 1,000 audits that year. Right? There's not enough security engineers in the world to do our methodology in 10 years to reach 1,000 audits. Right? So people grow very quickly and want the cash. Yeah.
Thank you for this interesting talk. So I had a question. So you said you guys adopt a blind auditing approach. So wouldn't that mean it would be better sometimes to employ separate auditors from all over the world, not from a company, to be auditing the project, so that they're not communicating or have no way of communicating together? Yes,
that's another way of doing it. We do that internally, and we quite often, I mean, the bigger projects, they often employ us in parallel of trail of bits or consensus diligence or someone like this, or one after the other, and we sometimes get to talk to them, sometimes not. But it's always interesting when you compare findings. But here the advantage is, that you get a single report. We already fight it out between each other what really is an issue, and we particularly managed to remove a large number of false positives, because if you're a single guy or a team looking at the same thing and you all bias each other, then it's easy to just convince everyone there's an issue. And if I've missed an issue that you have found, I'll make sure I look very deeply into this to make that it's not a false positive. So we deliberately manage to get a very concise result for the client.
Thank you for your talk. The question that I have is, based on the talk, it seems that everything boils down pretty much to understanding if the auditors spend time on looking on your code and doing what they're supposed to do. So I'm curious if you're exploring or at least look at this concept where the projects injecting the bugs into their code base just to make it to serve as a kind of proof of work. If the auditors did their job, if they spent specific amount of time to detect those vulnerabilities, maybe you experienced this during your audits or.
Yeah, we've experienced this and several times, and we prefer that if we know before that it's done, because sometimes it could be seen as a way of the client to get findings removed from the report. So one nice way of doing this we've seen and we were very in favor of was a team just having an internal audit. Then they left certain bugs that were found in the project. So they were real bugs, not artificial. So they were not, not silly things that you just find directly easily. And then they generated a hash of all the descriptions of this and published this. So they could later prove to us that they were really injected bugs. And that worked really well, and we actually did very well, which was sort of a relief. But it's sometimes, you say, oh, this is something we did on purpose, and it doesn't really look that way. You just don't, it's embarrassing and you don't want it in the report, right? So that's, because the report is public and it says fixed, but it still says what was found. Yeah. Okay, great.
I think you touched something super interesting, like audit report cleaning. And so I hear that many times that projects have an issue with getting an audit report and many issues are being found, and that there's kind of an incentive to remove these findings from the audit report. I personally don't agree with that at all. I think why would be a project ashamed about it? But what is your take on audit report cleaning and how to tackle it, and what's the motivation for the project, or how can we motivate them to understand that it's not a bad thing to be transparent about it and it's not shameful?
Yeah, it's sometimes a difficult conversation to have, and I mean, our policy is if it's extremely bad, we will tell you before we even write the report, and then if you decide to rewrite everything and don't publish the project, then we don't have to publish the report, right? But usually we try to convince people that having the report public is not a bad thing, even if there's critical findings in there and they've been fixed. It just shows that you've done your due diligence. Very occasionally we get clients that are not happy, and they're usually the clients where we're already doubtful if to take them on or not. There's sort of some red flags, and sometimes they fall through our due diligence, and we have to have a very uncomfortable conversation. And what we always do, we allow each team to write a reply, which we verbatimly copy into the report. So our reports are published as a Creative Commons non-derivative attribution thing. So you can do with it whatever you want, but you cannot modify it, right? So we own the copyright of that report, and we add it's in our contract that they can add a client reply to each issue, and we publish that. So if they don't agree, or want to give an explanation why it is, sometimes they put things like, oh, this particular contract was submitted to the audit too early, it hadn't gone through internal auditing, and if they want to do that, they can, but for the good teams, it's usually not necessary.
I'm more worried about audit reports where no findings are in. When I look at a report like this is when I get antsy about stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we've never had a report where we didn't have any findings. It is sometimes, you have a very good project and you have 3 informational and 1 minor finding, and you sort of publish this, and there's questions, why didn't you find more? It was really good. If someone, some of the big teams, they employ 3 security guys internally. They already maybe had another audit before. They had done a formal verification program. So it's sometimes difficult, but yeah, again, the track record of the auditor usually speaks for itself. If you have an auditor that is on this RECT 100 list, I mean, it's very easy to get on there, right? We are not on there, but we might be one day. I mean, a part of this is luck, right? But if you're on there in 50 out of the 100 top 100 entries, then and all your reports say no findings, then there's an issue. Okay.